it may seem to you that Buddhism or early Buddhism sort of rejects pleasure, that it doesn't like us to have pleasurable lives. And I want to discuss that in today's video, in particular looking at the ways in which a minimalist lifestyle can be a help and potentially a hindrance in this particular example. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So I had an email a while back by Johannes Cairns who asks about this, who asks about how it seems that, first of all, that in Buddhism there's a kind of a reaction against having a pleasurable life or against pleasure in general. And yet it seems as though all of our lives are based around pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. No matter where we look, it looks as though we're choosing things based on what gives us most pleasure, and we're choosing against things that provide us pain. There's sort of no doubt that that is, to one extent, a correct way of describing how we act in the world. And so how are we going to kind of reconcile this with the apparent arguments from early Buddhism and Buddhism in general, again, that pleasure is a problem, that we have to become okay with pain in some respect, that we have to make our peace with pain, or dukkha as it's sometimes described in Pali. And in this regard, it doesn't seem to matter whether we pursue what we might call a minimalist lifestyle or a maximalist lifestyle. I did an earlier video on minimalism and its comparisons to the thought processes and the philosophy of early Buddhism. I'll put a link to that video down below in case you want to know more. Minimalism is kind of a recent approach, we might say practice, in trying to pare our lives down somewhat. It comes from a general idea, which I'll get into, of minimalism in the arts, minimalism in architecture, and so on. And this makes minimalism, this sort of approach makes minimalism a sort of a way we can live our lives. And as I say, it doesn't seem as though there's really a difference, though, when it comes to pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, whether we're living minimalist or maximalist lives. So what I want to do is to sort of discuss this a bit and then come back to the issue of minimalism at the end, or nearer to the end. First of all, we can see that there is a problem with living a sort of an indulgent, what we might call a maximalist lifestyle. The Buddha himself describes this. He describes how before he was enlightened, when he was still a relative youth, he lived a life of what we might call luxury back in the day. That is to say, he says he had different lotus ponds just for him, in each pond a different colored lotus, that he had the finest clothes, the finest sandalwood, the finest food. He says that he was provided with 3 different houses, one for each season, the summer, the winter, and the rainy season, which are the 3 seasons in India of the day. He says that he was entertained by musicians, all of whom were female. So we have some idea of indulgence, perhaps sensual indulgence, over a period of years during his youth. And we can think of nowadays similar kinds of things. If you remember that horrible show from I think it was the 1980s called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, that's kind of the thing that the Buddha is trying to put in our minds here. That there are some people who pursue these kinds of maximalist lifestyles. And it's clear how these are lifestyles that are directed around the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of pleasurable kinds of experiences. But it's also, I think, should be clear that they're lifestyles built around the avoidance of pain. And there are various ways that this avoidance comes true. Some of the most apparent ones are indulgence in drugs and alcohol and various forms of delusion like that. But there also are more insidious ways, ways of just keeping ourselves busy, partying, traveling, just regular kinds of busyness that occupies the mind, and so keeps us from thinking about whatever kinds of pain are really lying underneath what we're experiencing. One of the classic ways, I think, that most people try to avoid pain is simply by shutting it out, by either pretending it doesn't exist or by diverting themselves from it so they don't have to look at it. And by remaining busy, I think a lot of us, indeed even in our jobs, which may not seem indulgent, but nevertheless may amount to a form of indulgence, we spend our time doing these things, these jobs, which we may not enjoy because at some level we are thinking to ourselves that they're keeping us from having to look at whatever it is that's underlying it all, which is a kind of pain. And these approaches, it should be clear, foster delusions. They foster delusions on both sides. They foster delusions about the importance, the goodness, the satisfactoriness of the pleasures that we're really going after. And they also foster delusions about the lack of pain, because the pain is really still there, we're simply looking away from it. Now, that is a description of what we might call the maximalist lifestyle, the indulgent lifestyle, but the same kinds of issues, or similar ones at any rate, come up even in a relatively minimalist lifestyle. And here I'm thinking in particular of Marie Kondo. If you don't know her, she is a sort of a personality who is well known for minimalism, a kind of minimalism, for tidying up our lives and throwing away the inessential. I did a video as well on her, and I'll put a link to that down below in case you don't know her or would like to know more, would like to know how she might relate to Buddhism and other things. And her approach isn't simply about throwing away the inessential and the stuff we don't need, but rather about retaining those things that, as she says, spark joy. That is to say, she's trying to distill our lives down to those things that spark the most pleasure in us, so that we end up being surrounded only by the things that are most pleasurable, and less by the things that simply clutter things up and, as a result, perhaps block our views of what is most pleasurable. So this as well is a way of living a more pleasurable life, of pursuing pleasure, if you like. And in the same sense, I think minimalism as an aesthetic movement, which sort of got going in the mid-20th century, although roots, of course, long back before that, but in any event, is an aesthetic movement based around a notion of purity, of clarity, of sort of limpidness, of being able to see the true nature of things by having things less cluttered. The idea being that there is a sort of an aesthetic benefit or purity to simply seeing the way things are in their simplest form, rather than sort of messing things up with a lot of clutter. And so the very, we should say, famous or well-known the architect Mies van der Rohe, who built a lot of buildings, particularly in Chicago, skyscrapers, he was well known for his expression, less is more, in the sense that as you pare things down and make things simpler, there is a benefit, let's say, in aesthetic pleasure. That's one way to look at it anyway. So, for example, as you pare down things, you're able to see the actual structure of the building, what's holding it up, so that the I-beams, the pillars that are actually structurally important, are the ones that are on display, as opposed to having the building structure be hidden behind a whole bunch of facade and false front and pretty decoration, which to the minimalist would seem delusional in a sense, that there is certainly some element here of delusiveness with the way we construct buildings, because we're pretending that the structure isn't there, or at least we're trying to cover it up to some extent. Now, as we might expect from an aesthetic movement, a movement grounded in a particular kind of aesthetic philosophy or point of view, things changed. And as time moved on, we had a separate view. So for example, the postmodernist architect Robert Venturi liked to respond to Mies van der Rohe's claim that less is more by saying less is a bore. That is to say that less stuff, less decoration around, didn't really make things more beautiful, it simply made things more dull. And so what we have is an example of, if you like, different strokes for different folks. That each person has their own aesthetic taste. Some people prefer less of stuff, other people prefer a little bit more. There's no way to answer which is really better. Different people get pleasure from different things. The point here being, though, that minimalism itself is a kind of pursuit of pleasure. It's a pursuit of a particular kind of pleasure, a particular kind of subtle pleasure, if you like. We can think of somebody, for example, we can compare two people. Now, one person loves very expensive or elaborate meals provided by a French chef, many different courses, and food that's constructed very carefully and all the rest. And another person may have much simpler tastes, but still like their own flavor of granola in the morning and be very upset if their flavor of granola isn't available in the local grocery store. Both of these are pursuits of pleasure in their own way. The monastic Bhikkhu Bodhi like to talk about how even monastics who have given up virtually everything, have virtually nothing, no possessions, nevertheless can become attached to, in the sense of looking for pleasure within the small number of possessions that they own. So they may find a particular style of begging bowl to be preferable, the one that they want, or perhaps they don't have it and would like to exchange their begging bowl for a different one in a different style, or a different fabric of a robe, a different cut of robe, let's say, a different color perhaps. All of these are ways in which the pursuit of pleasure can even be apparent in very, very minimalist kinds of lifestyles. So you might think that there's really absolutely no escaping from it. No matter where you are along the road, you're always going to be pursuing pleasures and avoiding pains. And to an extent that's true, although it's said that at enlightenment or at awakening, things do change in a radical way, and we really give up all of this attachment to these pleasures. That said, even the Buddha himself had his preferences. He preferred quiet over noise, in particular the noise of monastics chattering with each other. He preferred deep states of meditative absorption. He preferred to be by himself sometimes. So it's not to say that even awakened beings don't have their preferences. It's simply to say that they become less attached, or indeed, to some extent, perhaps completely unattached to these preferences. That is, there's no particular emotional attachment to them. They simply exist as the ways that you would prefer things, but if they don't happen, they don't happen. That's sort of how we can think of things as we move along. Nevertheless, there certainly is an extent to which the subtler pleasures that we might see in, let's say, a minimalist, or in, let's say, a monastic, there is an extent to which these are somewhat easier to get rid of than the more maximalist pleasures that we saw before of the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha when he was before he was awakened, with all of his surroundings and different palaces. That is a lifestyle which really does attach us more to the world than a more minimalist lifestyle would, at least potentially. Now, why do I say that complex or maximalist pleasures are stickier, are more problematic? One of the reasons is that they are involved more directly in issues of social hierarchy. That is to say, that one of the pleasures involved with maximalism, like we saw before, is that it is a display of our own wealth, power, influence. being able to afford or being able to find a way to achieve certain pleasures, it may not even be a matter of money, but simply a matter of connections, demonstrates our position in a social system. And that positioning, particularly if we think of ourselves as at the summit of this or near the summit, enters into enormous issues of personal identity. That is to say, we become very involved, self-involved in our positioning. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel better than other people. There's an enormous amount of conceit involved in that, which is resolved by, or which is displayed through, these kinds of, this kind of what we might call, or what has been called in the past, conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is only apparent in these kinds of maximalist lifestyles. It's less so when we get to the minimalist lifestyle. And so, as a result, since these maximalist lifestyles are so caught up in issues of society, they can be, to that extent, at least to one extent, much more difficult to get rid of, because we would have to also be getting rid of, to an extent, our own social status. And this is one of the things that strikes us when it comes to the Buddha, is that he was willing to give up this high social status. Now, there are other factors as well that I think we also have to keep in mind that rub both ways. So it's not simply a matter of status. Another issue has to do with views. And this is one of the ways I think that minimalism also can be very sticky as a viewpoint, is that any position that we find ourselves in can become very associated with views. That is to say, it's not simply a matter of the physical or perceptive pleasures that we gain through, let's say, minimalism, through a minimalist lifestyle, being surrounded only with things that spark joy, or only with a building that only shows its skeleton and so on. But rather that if we are a certain sort of intellectual, let's say, we may get caught up in all of the stories that surround these approaches, these aesthetic approaches. We may get caught up in the stories about clarity and purity and authenticity. And as a result, we attach to the viewpoints. We attach to the viewpoints more than perhaps we even attach to the pleasures involved. And we have to also be clear that many of the minimalist lifestyles that I was discussing before actually are not minimalist in the sense of being inexpensive and easy to achieve. While it's maybe easy to throw things out, as Marie Kondo suggests, it certainly is not easy to build a Mies van der Rohe building. In fact, Mies van der Rohe buildings were notorious for being very expensive to build. That is to say, if you're going to show all of the structural components, all of a sudden those structural components can't be built out of ordinary steel. They have to be built in a particular way so that they look pretty. Their surfaces have to be finished precisely. They can't be just laid down anywhere. They have to be laid down in particular corners of a room so that they make a kind of an elegant space, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the reasons why Mies van der Rohe didn't build as many buildings as he might, and people who copy him don't really copy him directly, because to do so would be too expensive. And if you want to buy, I should say, a Mies van der Rohe house nowadays, or rebuild one, it would cost you a fortune. So we have to be, I think, clear that minimalism itself is, at least in how we find it today, in some of its most famous incarnations, less minimalist than we might actually have thought. But all that aside, the main point here is that any viewpoint, any particular philosophy, any particular strategy that we use can become an object of clinging if we cling to the views, if we cling to the beliefs around it. Now, that's not necessarily to say that the beliefs are delusional or false. They might be true. Indeed, It may very well be that minimalism, in some respects, involves a kind of clarity and limpidness to life. There's nothing necessarily false about that. But insofar as we make that an object of clinging and become attached to it and think of it as mine and something that as a result I'm going to become emotionally involved with and defend and so on, it is to that extent less skillful. Now, we also, I think, have to keep in mind throughout all of this discussion that the Buddha argued for a middle path between indulgence on the one hand and extreme asceticism on the other. That is to say that the Buddha, while the Buddha was not in favor of indulgence, whether of a maximalist or even a minimalist lifestyle, he certainly wasn't in favor of extreme asceticism either. And there certainly are examples in which the Buddha might have or would have or in fact did say that so-and-so really should put a little bit more pleasure in their lives. Now, for the Buddha, that might involve meditation and so on more than buying stuff. But in any event, the Buddha did, in certain respects and at certain times, advocate that people should, if they were lay people, spend money on things that were pleasurable, rather than simply, let's say, hoarding their cash. That was something the Buddha certainly did say, that spending money on pleasurable things was a good idea if you were a lay person. And indeed, if you were a monastic, that spending your time simply in ascetic practices was not going to be beneficial. You had to find a middle way here. And I think of a famous story about the Thai meditation master Ajahn Chah. At one point, one of the students of Ajahn Chah apparently went up to him and complained because it seemed that Ajahn Chah was giving contradictory messages to different students, and this particular person was confused. You're telling one thing to one student and something completely opposite to a different one, so what are we to believe, he says. And Ajahn Chah responded, he said, basically we're all walking along the same road, but this road is relatively narrow, and on both sides there are pits, there are depressions that people could fall into and injure themselves. And so if I see one of my students wandering off too much to the left, I'll tell him to come right. And if I see another of my students wandering off too far to the right, I'll tell him to walk left. Now, from the outside, it may appear that I am giving contradictory kinds of messages, but that's only because people are doing different things. And in the same way, we could think of the Buddha as saying to some people, please, a little bit less indulgence, that would be better for you. A little bit more of a minimalist lifestyle might be good. But he might say to others, well, that's too little. Try to put a little bit more happiness and pleasure into your life. Pleasure itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. And indeed, I did an earlier video on pleasure, on what's wrong with pleasure, if anything. And I'll put a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos, please do take a look over at my Patreon page and join us if you like. Thanks so much to all my patrons over on Patreon, and we hope to catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you be well.